Ordinarily, I start these conversations with a kind of an introduction where I talk about Elliott and his business and everything. And we are going to do that. But first, Elliott wanted to start with a question for all of you.
Sure. So we're going to talk about the fundamental problem in the affordable housing business, which is how do you allocate finite resources in an environment where demand is constantly going to outstrip supply. And so I'd like you all to think about the choice that public policymakers, affordable housing developers, people working at the Housing Authority, the frankly kind of fucked up choice that people have to make every day, today, right now, which is where do those dollars go? And so you can believe really one of two things on the spectrum. The first over here is that you think the role of affordable housing is to maximize individual benefit. You are trying to help a family improve their situation in life and give them better access to schools, healthcare, jobs, those kinds of things. That tends to be the more expensive option. So basically it means one person gets to live in Pacific Palisades or Brentwood. What are the other places out here?
Santa Monica.
Santa Monica, right? So one person gets to live in Santa Monica, but their life is going to be, I would think, significantly improved. But that costs a lot more. Rent costs more, construction costs more, land costs more, and if you only have a certain amount of money, you can help fewer people. And so then the other end of the spectrum, and the answer is probably the truth is somewhere in between, you have over here, the goal of government and the role of the affordable housing programs is to be a safety net. It's to prevent homelessness, it's to pull people up who are living on the street or living in their car, which is not as fun, I can tell you from experience. And you think, all right, you don't get to live in Santa Monica because you just don't. But you don't have to be homeless. We are going to put, for every one person who lives in Santa Monica, 2 people live in Inglewood?
Inglewood, sure. Take your pick, the Inland Empire.
2 people live in Inglewood. And so it's maybe not great housing, but it's safe and it's decent and it's a little harder to get to work and the schools aren't as good. The medical facilities aren't as good. It's a tougher existence for those people, but more people get housing. And so this is a problem everyone in my business deals with all the time, and it sucks. And you may think, well, we should be more efficient with our resources, or we should try to, be better at building affordable housing, and all that shit is true, but it's today's problem right now. If you only have $100 million, are you helping more people who have a slightly rougher existence, or are you choosing to help fewer people and optimize for better outcomes? So at the end of this, I'd like you all to maybe have some thoughts on it. So that's how we'll start.
Love it. And I think that really helps to frame the rest of this discussion. But let's sort of, to give everyone a bit more context, I want to talk first about your present situation, the company that you've got, and what you're doing briefly. And then I want to back up and talk a little bit about how you got to where you are, because that's also like kind of a remarkable story. So tell us about what's going on now.
Sure. So I manage a company called Hayden Glade. We own about 4,000 units. We're focused on all kinds of affordable housing. So some of the programs you all probably know are Section 8, the low-income housing tax credit. There's other state and local programs. Really, if you can think of a dumb, painful, slow way to make money, that's the thing that we sort of specialize in. We manage through a fund, so I've done tax credit development in an old life. We're investing through a permanent capital vehicle now. Fortunate that we've raised the money that we've raised. Honestly, really quite lucky how things have turned out. So we tend to buy pretty rough housing projects. These can be existing affordable housing, or it can be market rate housing that we're going to convert into affordable housing. We see some pretty horrific things, but it's nice when we can step in and you renovate them and you just sort of make the lives of the people who are living there a little less difficult.
And I mean, I love that. I think many of you who've been following me for a while know that I sometimes question whether what I've done in my career is like socially net useful. It's like, I think maybe it on balance is fixing up old apartment buildings for affluent kids is like, I think it's maybe possibly socially net positive, but you catch me the wrong day and I might think the other way. So what I love about what you're doing is that I think it's inarguably socially net positive, in addition to being like a great way to make money. So very cool, and I'm hoping that as part of this discussion, we open some eyes today among some entrepreneurial, capable people to maybe explore these opportunities themselves. So I want to know how you got into this, because this is not like the easiest thing to just walk into. Tell us a bit about your background.
Let's see. I don't know how far back in the story to go. Things were sort of touch and go when I was a kid. When I was younger, they stabilized for a bit. Do any of you have kids in here who are teenagers? Show of hands, people have teenagers. And so I left the house when I was 16, and things sort of played out, I think, predictably when you have a 16-year-old living in Boston with, no real guidance. So I left the house. I was 16, bartended my way through college, and got a job working for a small investment company in 2007. Things were kind of starting to look up, and that lasted for about 8 months, and then the Great Recession happened, and I was, disposed of. How did I get started in affordable housing? So I was living in the, God, this is fucking bleak. I was living in the basement of this restaurant. There's sort of more to the story, but I don't want to bore everyone with all of it. But I'm living in the basement of this restaurant. It's like a pizza shop. And a friend of mine had a valet parking company, and they used the basement for storage, for traffic cones and signs. And so he said, look, Elliott, you can stay here. I was trying to figure out what I was doing with my life. But if you can stay here for free, but you have to help me with some valet parking events it was a fair request. So I'm living in this basement, which is really great. And I'm working at this event. We have this steakhouse called Smith & Malinsky. Maybe it's out here. But there was this beautiful old castle in Boston. And so there's an event. So I'm outside parking cars. This guy pulls up in his Mercedes, and his driver gets out and lets him out. And, all right. The guy who got out of the car knows my friend who owned the valet parking company, and he says, Elliott, come over here. I want you to meet Arthur. Arthur, meet Elliott. So it's Arthur Wynn, who started Wynn Companies, which is at the time, the largest affordable housing developer in the country. And Arthur was early to this event, so we were just sort of talking shit outside for a half hour or so. He must have seen something, gave me his card, and said, if you ever want to get lunch, you should come by the office. And so I spent 2 days looking at his card and thinking, what the fuck am I going to talk to this guy about? This guy hasn't worried about money in decades, and I have $19. But I also was tired of being poor and tired of being scared and tired of feeling horrible. And I thought, well, the current path has not been super fruitful, so fuck it. And I called him, and he said, Elliott, he was really gracious with his time, as guys like that can afford to be when they want to. And so Arthur became a friend and a mentor. I never worked for him. I knew somehow that it would really change our relationship, he was the one successful person I knew. And if he goes from being friend and mentor to boss, that didn't seem great. But so he, over the course of about a year or two, we'd meet up and have a drink and talk. And he said, I'm talking my book, but you seem to understand finance and affordable housing. Maybe you should think about real estate. Think about affordable housing, because it's really complicated. It'll take you a while to learn. But once you know it, what you know becomes a real barrier to entry. And so I cold called a broker. I Googled, Google wasn't as helpful back then. I Googled most successful or most prominent real estate brokers in Massachusetts, in Boston. And what you get are fucking realtors. So I called this guy from Sotheby's. I just cold called him and said, and he's still a dickhead to this day, but I called him and I said, I want to learn affordable housing, and I want to learn real estate. I can work for you for free. I can do probably 3 days a week because I have to bartend at night to cover my bills, but if you'll give me a shot, teach me what you know. And this was incredibly stupid. I should have called JLL or CBRE or anybody, but I ended up working for this grifter. And so I'm showing up. I had this really ill-fitting suit from Men's Warehouse, and I'd sit in this shitty office on Newbury Street, and I'd just make cold calls. I was just calling people. I didn't know enough about real estate to know that I shouldn't have been on the phone. I was just winging it. He was like, we have this to sell. I'm calling people. I kind of worked out from there. I taught myself affordable housing. I cold called this one woman who owned this really unique type of affordable housing, and I just kind of kept on her. We'd check in, and she said, all right, Elliott, I'll let you underwrite the deal. And I think she thought, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's calling from Sotheby's, but fuck it, I'm tired of him calling me. So she sends me the financials and all these regulatory agreements. Took me 3 weeks to underwrite a deal. I could do that in an hour now-ish. And I studied it, and I didn't know how to build financial models. So I was like teaching myself to build financial models on YouTube, and I'm doing research on affordable housing programs. And I called her, and I said, okay, I'm ready. And I started with the broker pitch of like, I just want to thank you so much for this opportunity. She goes, Elliott, stop, don't care. What's the number? I was like sweating on the phone, and I said 15.8 million. And there's a long pause. And she goes, that's somehow exactly right. Okay, we'll give you a shot. Let's see if you can sell this thing. So that was my first listing. It was this really unique type of affordable housing called a 13A, which I can tell none of you care about. And it was the first of its kind in the state that was coming out of its affordable restrictions. At the same time, the state is working on a program to preserve this very type of housing. So me, in a shitty suit at Sotheby's, happens to be at the intersection of like, these deals are coming free of their restrictions, and the state's calling me with input on what if we preserve it this way. It took off from there. I worked that. I got a bunch of those listings, sold them, learned about low-income housing tax credits and Section 8, and moved from the brokerage side to the development side, and then eventually started my own firm. So it's a longer answer than I was intending.
No, but very helpful. And that path, obviously, from brokerage into being a sponsor is a well-trod path. Yeah. I want to, ordinarily in these on-stage Reconvene talks, I would sort of dig into the past and talk about how you did that first deal and all that stuff. But what I'm going to try to do with this conversation is steer us more towards the present and what opportunities you see in the business. So can you I know that there's a multiplicity of affordable housing programs out there, and it varies by state and locality and everything. But like, maybe if you could walk us through, like, fundamentally at a basic level, like, what are the different categories?
Sure. So affordable housing, low-income housing, these are kind of, for all of you, really broad terms that describe a basket of things like cars or food or wine. So when people say affordable housing, low-income housing, they're all really talking about, fundamentally, housing that is affordable for people who are making below, let's say, 80 or 60 or 50 or 30% of AMI. There's ranges of need that are out there. Two of the most prevalent programs are the low-income housing tax credit. That's currently responsible for 94% of all new affordable housing development. It's been the most successful program in our country's history. It's developed about 3.5 to 3.6 million units so far. Another big program is the Section 8 program, and it's, as with all of these, it's pretty complicated, but there's really kind of two kinds of Section 8. One is a contract with the property. Those are called project-based vouchers. Those tend to trade like bonds. I mean, you've got basically the government guaranteeing 85% of the rent. The other kind of Section 8 is an individual tenant has a voucher. Some of you may have these in your properties. That tenant brings that voucher with them. So they move in, they're paying 30% of their income. The housing authority is paying whatever the balance is between that and your rent. But when they leave, they take that voucher with them. There's below market interest rate subsidy programs. There's local and state tax exemptions. There's subordinate debt. There's all kinds of weird programs that are out there that are really trying to solve the fundamental problem of you have market rate expenses and you have to deliver below market rent, and in a very competitive environment, how do you do that without going bankrupt?
That was extremely helpful. I want to dig into both sides of the low-income tax credit and also the Section 8, but maybe we can, to prioritize, if you were a naive potential entrant into this market, which of those two programs would you, or which of those two types of affordable housing do you think would be a more fruitful place to start?
I think if you've never done affordable housing before, I would encourage you, Section 8, project-based Section 8 deals are simpler to underwrite. They're also rougher. They're rough in a way that I think some people are not fully prepared for. You can see some.
Let's talk about that. Like,
yeah.
How does one of these deals happen, and why is it rougher?
It's rougher because everything's so interconnected. If you go back to the 20s, you and I were talking about this backstage, back when you had tenement houses, and then you had public housing, and you had there's affordable housing policies in our country sort of evolve over time. And each one is an attempt to iterate on what went wrong with the prior one. So Section 8 came before the low-income housing tax credit. Section 8, one of the challenges, similar to public housing, there's famous projects like Jordan Downs here in Watts, there's Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis. I talked about this on Twitter. Pruitt-Igoe was thousands, it was supposed to house 20 or 30,000 people, and it was so grisly that they tore it down after 18 years. They're like, nope, this is a mistake. We need a fucking do-over here, and they just mowed it down. Yeah. And so one of the challenges, the reason it gets so bad is, and like Cabrini Green in Chicago, some of these may be ringing a bell, you have really intense concentration of poverty. Most people who are living in these buildings are making below $15,000 a year. Sidebar, I worked for a guy who, we owned some Section 8 projects at my old company, and he would show up to them in his, he had a BMW 7 Series, in a suit and a power tie and a whole fucking thing. And I asked him one time, I said, how do you feel about the optics around, he and I got along well. I wasn't like calling. I said, how do you feel about the optics around your suit costs like $7,000 and you have a $130,000 car, you show up here, how do you feel about what that portrays to the residents? And he said, people like to know who's in charge. And I was like, God, you're such a fucking asshole. No, man. And so that's the reason I dress like this. That's the reason everyone in our company wear jeans and boots. We sort of dress like hillbillies. And a lot of it is from that like, you have to show up the properties and be aware of your surroundings. And so in these Section 8 deals, it's people who are really the most at risk. They're making very little money, and what happens when you have a high concentration of that is all of us are a product of our environment, and so if all you see around you is sort of a lack of opportunity in a tougher part of town, poverty is very cyclical, and it's like hard for people to get out. So these Section 8 projects, the only way out is sort of selling drugs, robbing. There's not, it's, one generation isn't showing the next, well, you should graduate high school and go to college, you should get a job. Like, you only know what you see. And so the people who have money at some of our properties are the drug dealers. The guy with the Escalade parked out front, he doesn't work at Goldman, And so you see these like really tough situations. You see kids being abused, you see pets being abused, you see like people pimping out their daughters for rent, and like it's part of why people say you're so negative on Twitter. I'm like, fuck you. It's the things that I see every day that my path here was not ideal, and the things that I see when I go to these properties is not great. There's like a world that's out there right now while we're all sitting here in our polos nodding and smiling. There's people in really, really tough situations, and it doesn't end, and it gets worse at night, and you've got a nurse coming home, she's like someone in the family has a job, and I've seen it. The guys who are like selling drugs are heckling her. Get the fuck out of here. We don't want you living here. Like, because she has a job. And she'll say, I don't want you guys to stop playing music at 4 o'clock in the morning. And then they set her car on fire as like retribution for telling us to turn the music down.
So imagine you're a sicko sitting in the audience. You're like, what, that sounds great. I would like to make some money. Yeah. But yeah. So what happens? Like, do you go buy a building and then approach Section 8 and say, hey, I want to do a contract on the whole building? Like, how would you go about doing one of these deals?
So HUD is not issuing any new project-based vouchers. So you can't buy a market rate building and think, I'm going to put a contract on here. You can port a contract over from another property, but that's not for today's lesson. So you're going to want to buy an existing project-based Section 8 deal. A lot of these tend to be smaller. They're in secondary markets. I think smaller is sort of relative, but you could buy one that's like 50 units, 60 units. So they're not massive. They do have large complexes, but by and large, they're smaller. You could buy them for 5 to 10 million. Is probably
and these things
about right.
trade like, the cap rates must be pretty thin because the credit risk is so low.
Yeah, the cap rates are thin because the credit risk is really low. You're basically buying a government contract, and the real estate is like the byproduct. So the tenants will pay 30% of their income down to $25 for rent. That's like the lowest they can pay. So you would buy one of these. There's 6 different types of Section 8 contracts. I don't want to bore you all with the nuances, but if you see an option 3 or something called a mark to market, just don't buy it. That's like today's the only lesson is don't buy that because you don't get any rent increases. So you're putting yourself in a position where you get like nominal, it's like 2%, where you've got a rough tenant base, unknown capital risk, and capped rent, which is subpar.
Asymmetric in the wrong direction.
Yeah, exactly.
So which of those types of deals are potentially asymmetrical in the correct direction?
So what you're looking for are, the way these Section 8 contracts work, most of them, you get a rent adjustment every year. It's called an operating cost adjustment factor, or OCAF. And it's basically HUD says, here's how much we think your costs have increased over the past year, and so you get that rent increase. Then every 5 years, you can do a rent comp study and go back to HUD and say, well, actually, our competitors, we're renting for $1,100 for a one-bedroom, but all of our competitors are getting $1,300, and based on this study, we should get $1,300 as well. And the tenant doesn't feel any of that burden. The tenant is completely unaware. Where things get a little squirrely with the Section 8 world is if you're looking at a deal and the Section 8 contract rents are $300, $400, $500, $600, $1,000 above what you believe the market rent to be, it gets very hard to justify why you need yet another rent increase.
Got it. So you need to be comfortable with your existing. You need to be comfortable with the existing yield, and then hopefully you're walking that up over time. But if your rents are above market to begin with, then don't expect the margin.
Yeah, don't assume another markup. It's called a markup to market. That's an option 1, an option 2, or an option 4 contract. Where you have the ability every 5 years or so to go back to HUD and say, and you can tie it to a rehab, and it's kind of nice. There are these companies that do these rent comp studies where they'll show you your as is and your as improved values. So you review your business plan and say, we're going to do X, Y, Z and add these services. They'll give you your as improved rent, and it's pretty much gospel. I mean, HUD just takes these guys at their word, and so you kind of know ahead of time what your return on cost would look like on that renovation.
So you go find one of these existing deals, and are these contracts of indefinite duration, or do they have an end date and you have to renegotiate them or something?
They're pretty much indefinite. I mean, they're usually 20-year contracts. They have 5, they have 10-year, but they're pretty much indefinite. You'll go back to HUD. HUD wants you to keep providing affordable housing, so as long as you're a reasonable operator, the contract kind of goes on forever.
Okay, so you go find one of these things, you're looking, and you kind of are underwriting it, I guess, like a normal apartment deal in the sense of there's some going in cap rate, there's some leverage you're going to use, there's some plan for improving it and walking the rents up. Now, is it the case that these things, that those numbers are close to what you would get for a comparable market deal, or is the credit such that you're just sort of going to be accepting lower yields?
No, they're about the same because the credit is outweighed by the sporadic chance that a tenant will beat the shit out of you, and so there's like return on fist fight.
Hence the mallet.
Yeah, and so no, it's about the same. You have a more durable income stream, but there's also just like, oh, they burned the building down again,
So now, I guess is the financing a little bit better? Are you getting better terms from a lender because it's affordable?
Yeah, on Section 8 deals, you can get great financing. On all affordable, typically you can get banks that have a Community Reinvestment Act need, and so you can tend to get better pricing both through Fannie and Freddie and also through HUD. On some of these project-based Section 8 deals, and I do not recommend doing this, but they'll give you up to 93% leverage.
Whoa.
Yeah. So if you really like playing it fast and loose, you can
gotta burn down your own house too.
But getting a HUD mortgage is it's horrible. It takes forever.
Yeah, these are like 9 to 12 month type things.
Yeah,
right?
I like to joke around and say if you've ever been to the DMV and been like, I want to partner with this person, that's HUD, and they hate you. There's just like a level of disdain where you're like, I just want to build some affordable housing, and they're like, no, get the fuck out of my office. So again, Section 8, it can work. It can be super valuable. If you're sitting here and thinking, I kind of like the idea of affordable housing, I don't like the idea of sporadic violence, then you could do the low-income housing tax credit program. And you can either buy these that are existing or you can do new development. And it's really complicated, but every state, whatever market you're in, the state housing finance agency, so Mass Housing or Florida Housing Finance Corp or Texas Department of they issue what's called a qualified allocation plan or a QAP. And this is the state telling you, the developer, here's what we'd like to see. because these are scarce resources, they're competitive. So you are submitting your project, I'm submitting mine, they can only award so many dollars, so they try to go for the highest scoring projects.
So they tell you in advance, like, here's what
Tell
we're
you in
looking
advance.
for.
Yeah, and so you're looking at your project, and it could be using tax credits to renovate an existing apartment complex. That's certainly a viable strategy. You can do that for market rate. It really doesn't matter. Or you're using tax credits to develop new. And the state will tell you, this is what we want to see. More specifically, we want to see set-asides for seniors, or we want to incentivize families in commuter hubs, or it changes over the years. And you'll hear, does the project score well? In the qualified allocation plan, there's literally a scoring tool where you can look at your project, and it'll say, okay, how many 3-bedroom units do you have? Then you get a certain amount of points. It's like a Matryoshka doll of spreadsheets. When you get into applying, it's just this like endless workbook after workbook after workbook. But if you can survive the kind of brain damage associated with the application, it can be a really interesting approach. And so the way the tax credit program works, very simply, Moses has a project, he's got a piece of land, or he's got an old mill building that he wants to turn into housing. He's going to review the qualified allocation plan and say, okay, I want to apply for low-income housing tax credits. And there's 9% credits, and there's 4% credits. Really simply, 9 is greater than 4. People want the 9s, the 4s are not as attractive. But only the top 2-3% of projects get the 9% credit, so you're probably going to do a 4% tax credit transaction. You'll get some tax-exempt bond financing. Most of these deals have 5, 6, 7, 8 different sources in order to make it all work. But the basic trade is Moses says to the state, I have here all my sources, I need $10 million in tax credits. And they say, great, Moses, that sounds good to us. They give him $10 million in credits. It's not actually useful to you unless you have a $10 million tax liability, which you might.
I do not.
You don't. So you're going to then sell those credits. Well, and technically what you're doing is you're selling your property. The credits are given to the property, not to the GP, not to the LP. So basically you've bought this property and then you're selling 99.99% of it right away to your tax credit investor, a Bank of America, a Wells Fargo. There's some tax credit syndication shops, and they want some return, so they'll give you 90 cents on the dollar. So now you have $9 million in upfront equity that's kind of free. I mean, there's restrictions on your rent and that kind of stuff, but that tends to help you solve the construction gap in order to rent your units out at 60% of area median income.
Very helpful. I want to leave a couple of minutes anyway for Q&A. But my final question before I open it up is, if someone wanted to dig more into specifically the low-income tax credit world, what is the first place to go to start like reading about that? Who should they talk to? What should they read? Like, what's the best introduction?
Yeah, there's a great company called Novogradac. They're an accounting firm that tends to specialize in affordable housing. They have tons of resources on the low-income housing tax credit, new market tax credits, Section 8. They're just a wonderful source. You can also, every affordable housing project in the country, there's a public database. So if you go, you can search the low-income housing tax credit database, and HUD has an Excel file that you can download. It's every project in the country, it's all the units, it's tons of data about it, it tells you who owns it. So like finding these is not super challenging. They're like understanding how to work them is pretty complicated. So there's about 43,000 low-income housing tax credit projects in the country. There's a Section 8 database you can download, also in an Excel file. There's 27,000-ish Section 8 properties. So you can do that, and you can start to research these properties and call the owners, and yeah.
That seems great. Okay, thank you for that. So let me just bang through a couple of these questions. My friend Justin Farron asks, you said that HUD is not issuing any new project-based HAP contracts. Is that correct? Okay, there you go, Justin. That was easy. All right, and then I'm going to combine questions from a couple of people. And the question is basically, like, how do you think about the balance between rents and expenses in a world where expenses have been increasing so quickly, insurance, et cetera? Like, obviously the top line is somewhat capped. How do you think about the margin declining?
Yeah, your income is sort of capped. Rents are a function of area median income. So in the market rate world, you can get these big spikes in rent. Rent can go up 15% in 1 year because of some externality. In the affordable world, it doesn't really happen that way. Everything is pegged to area median income. So you want to be in a market that you believe in, where there's some employment story there. It feels there's a good growth trajectory, and you might get 3% a year. So what you're seeing this with insurance rates rising a ton. Affordable housing projects is a good rule of thumb for people who are underwriting. It's probably going to be about $1,000 to $1,500 per unit more expensive to operate than your market rate project. So don't think that you can use kind of the market rate expenses. People do weird shit. They steal your appliances and sell them on Craigslist. They just there's sort of it's just more expensive to operate. There's far more maintenance requests. I've got thousands of insane stories about those. So you're looking at an expense margin of 60% is probably your expenses. Yeah. But that's not new. It wasn't like 30% a few years ago, and now it's 60 and everything's up. That's always been sort of how it's looked. Is you don't have a ton of rent. The real argument for affordable housing is you're always the lowest cost housing provider in the market. So you may not get that 15% spike, but you don't get a lot of the value.
And you don't have vacancy problems.
Well, you still can if you don't have a great property or something like that. But in general, there's typically more demand than there is supply for these projects. So yeah, your income stream is relatively reliable.
You've talked about the multiplicity of problems of these properties. What are, if you had to boil it down to the most impactful steps that you take to improve one of these properties that you buy? Is there when you have do you have a list in your head of these are the 10 things we always do? What are the top few of those things to make things better?
Yeah, the first thing we do, and it's just sort of a sad reality of affordable housing, is many of these people are used to just being ignored. And their maintenance goes unfixed. One bathroom doesn't work. They have mold in the walls. The basics of running real estate, often there's these predatory owners who are not taking care of the real estate. And so the first thing that we do when we're buying a deal is we send out a work order list. And we just say, tell us what's broken. And then we typically have... the average project we buy is about 200 units. And so during the first week, we'll have 30 maintenance guys. We hire contract labor just for the first week or two. It's sort of just to overwhelm the residents with a response. And we immediately, the day we close or the day after we close, there's just a sea of maintenance guys that we've pulled in from some are on contracts, some are from other properties, and we're knocking on doors, we're doing work orders. Most people in affordable housing, in their hierarchy of needs, subway tile is not
not up there.
Yeah, no. What they want is safe, decent housing. They want somebody to be responsive. They probably would prefer black appliances over white appliances because those look a little dated. But it's really fundamentally is they just want that taken care of. So that's the first thing that we do. And you'd be surprised at the response you get. Once, typically, we show up, we get a first list of work orders, and most of the residents think, this shit's never going to get done. Well, I guess I'll fill this out. And then they see 20 or 30 maintenance guys crawling all over the place, and you get a whole nother flood of work orders coming in. So that's the first thing that we do. The next thing that we do is we hire a resident service coordinator position, and we've seen this is really impactful. It helps some with leasing, but it's really big for retention. In every single community, there are community resources to help low-income folks. It could be job training. It could be, financial planning classes.
After-school tutoring for the kids,
yeah,
whatever.
It can really be anything. It can also just be helping folks, improve their lives. So the community is providing these things, often for free, and they're in search of people to provide it too. You ask any provider of some of these nonprofits, we struggle to reach the community. And then in your property, you've got a whole bunch of people who may not have the life skills or the resources to know how to go out and find those, to access that. So we have the resident service coordinator is just there to basically pull the resources in the community and make the residents aware of what's out there. We had problems during COVID. Well, we're going to be able to pay rent. There were lots of state and local programs that were trying to get to properties. They had money.
They just couldn't find the people.
They couldn't find them. So having a resident service coordinator, you'd have these tenants who were freaked out. They just lost their job. I started my company March 2nd of 2020. I mean, I'd been raising money before, but I signed all our docs on March 2nd. And people were saying, have you heard about this boat outside of San Francisco? A bunch of people get sick. And so that was not ideal timing for me. And the whole world sort of shut down, and I'm trying to buy affordable housing where the people who are working in the service industry are by and large living. And so you have all these people like, I just got laid off from my job at the hotel. I would like to pay rent. I cannot pay you. And so having a resident service coordinator helps smooth a lot of that out. Those are two big ones.
Really helpful. I think one more question. Sorry, this has been amazing, and we could probably go for a really long time. You've had experience sort of across the range of affordable housing. If there were like one change or innovation that either the government or the philanthropic sector could make to kind of smooth the path to providing more and better affordable housing, is there one thing where you're like, you fucking idiots, like just do this and it would help a ton?
Yeah, I say that often. I think, so yes, there's a couple things. The first is zoning. That's a big one, is any kind of housing. It really doesn't matter. Like, it's not rocket science. More housing will drive the price of that housing down. But more specifically with affordable housing, I think one of the things, and we talk about this as a goal for the company, people say, well, what do you want for AUM, or what do you want for a number of units? And all those goals seem sort of not real to me, or not in a way that I care about. I'm not acutely aware of how much money I'm making. So I want to grow the company to the point where we can have a real impact on public policy. I think that's the fundamental goal. And so we see a lot of these affordable housing programs, the amount of waste that exists, it's 30 to 35% more expensive to build affordable housing than market rate housing. I see some of these Section 8 contracts where the rent is so far above the market that's, to me, just a really poor allocation of resources. So I would like to see HUD do rent reasonableness studies where they look at the contract rent and say, does this feel correct? Like, we ask that question when we're underwriting all the time, what is true? And we ask HUD, or HUD to ask, is this, you're in Newark, New Jersey, what do you mean your one bed rent is $1,800? Or you're Camden, New Jersey. We looked at a deal or Trenton, we looked at a deal that was half Section 8 and half market rate, and the Section 8 rents were twice what the market rate rents were. The unit across the hall was renting for $550 a month, but the Section 8 unit was getting $1,100. So that should stop. That's a bad use of resources. If we had no homeless people, it'd be, fuck it, spend the money on whatever you want. I don't care. But there are people who are right now living on the street and need services, and we're allocating dollars in a really insane way. So I'd like to see more rent reasonableness tests done by HUD. And then on the low-income housing tax credit side, I'd like to see the number of consultants come way down. What happens with government programs is when the incentive, low-income housing tax credit, it's a fee business. It's all about the development fee, the construction management fees. Once it's built, the real estate is sort of a pain in the ass to the tax credit developer because they're not making any more money. I guess they make a property management fee, but it's all about the upfront fees. And when that's the incentive, a whole bunch of consultants and government people line up to sort of take their cut. And so there's just a ton of bloat.
Which then drives more complexity and more consultants and more.
That's not ideal. You'd like to see a little bit more developer involvement in how do we streamline this, because the pursuit costs on a tax credit project could be $300,000 to $400,000 just to get to the point where you're submitting your application. And then once it's done, there's all kinds of additional, what's a good example, how to make this real? We bought a deal in Georgia. We did a tax credit transaction on it. The owner we bought it from replaced the roof 3 or 4 years ago. The roof was fine. But because the tax credit application process says you need to have a roof with an estimated useful life of 30 years. So you basically need to put on a new roof.
So you rip off.
We had to rip off a 3-year-old roof to put on a new one. If you ask any reasonable person, like, that's fucking stupid, don't do that. But we used government dollars to do it. But that was just the rule. If you had windows, it's those kinds of things that you think, I understand where it's coming from, that you want it to be serviceable, but there's not a lot of room for, does this feel correct? When you're working with government programs. So there's a ton of waste, unfortunately.
I think that I love that we just came full circle on this conversation, and from the beginning about like how do you allocate resources to then like a nuts and bolts example of poor resource allocation. Elliott, thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you.